So after you're done doing your sketches, it's time to sort of sit down and figure out what you're going to photograph and how you're going to photograph it. So the first thing you want to keep in mind is the lighting. When you're taking photographs of multiple objects and you're going to composite them together, you want to make sure that the lighting is consistent. So if it's a really sunny day and you wanted sort of overcast lighting, you might have to photograph it inside or bounce light. I wanted some pretty hard shadows in this. I might regret that later. I might need to reshoot, but I went outside, and here in this image you can see I set up just a big piece of white paper on the table outside and was placing objects on it to give it a clean white background. And the reason I did that is because then when I go to mask these out in Photoshop, my life will be a lot easier. So for instance, with this side view of the skull, just to make my life easier when I'm masking it out, I held up the paper on one side. So yeah, there's this shadow cast right here from the corner of the paper, but this is a warm enough tone that it'll be pretty easy to mask it out. And I tried to get a couple different angles of things. I had my sketches and I knew kind of how I wanted things, but sometimes once you take those photographs, your ideas change a little bit, you get new ideas. So instead of photographing things really precisely the first time, it's helpful to give yourself a lot of different photographs, give yourself some latitude, and then go back in and take photographs later. So then the other thing is I took some photographs of just abstract textures that I might use to kind of unify my image and warm things up a little bit. So I just took photos of the porch, some asphalt, the leaves outside, and I'll probably go back in and take some more photos later. Take a lot of different photographs, give yourself some creative latitude, and then bring it into Photoshop when you have enough to get started. Now the other thing is you can use photographs that you've taken back in the past before this assignment. So if I had a picture of a skull that was really good and I like the lighting of it, I could certainly use that as long as that photograph is my own. So you can use old photographs, but you do want to take new photographs for this project. So you don't want to rely on old photographs. You want to start with your sketch and then plan towards that. When you're ready to start compositing, go to Photoshop and say Create New, and make sure that it's set to HDTV 1080p, and it should say 1920 by 1080 pixels, 72 ppi. So this is really important. Make sure it's definitely set to that setting. Once you have that setting selected, say Create. So when I brought this coat in as my background, one of the things that I did was I control-clicked on it and set Reset Transform. And what that'll do is when I drag it in, it becomes a smart object. And when I reset Transform, it sets it to the default native resolution, which is quite a bit bigger than 1024 by or 1920 by 1024. So the advantage of this, let me deselect that, is that then I can sort of move this around and figure out, which part of this do I really want this to be at. Maybe I want it to be a different part, and then I can still scale it down and deform it if I want to. I can still scale it down and keep the aspect ratio the same. So I have a lot of flexibility with this. I could rotate it around. So as long as things are smart objects, it's not actually making destructive changes to it. So you have a lot of freedom to sort of figure out how you want things to be composed. So I'm going to go ahead and place this kind of like that, something like that. All right, now the next thing I did is I brought in this skull, and it's, again, the way I just dragged it in, it becomes a smart object. Again, this helps non-destructive editing. And then I added a mask to it. Now, you can see one of these things is that it has the image file name. So I'm going to rename this coat. This will be deer skull. So you want to get into the habit of renaming your files early, especially before you bring it into After Effects. Now I have this white background, and what I can do is use the magic wand tool. I'm setting the tolerance to about 32. You can try making this higher or lower depending on your background, but I can just click on this background and it selects everything within a certain color range. Once that's selected, then I can go to my marquee tool. I can go to Select and Mask, and I can kind of fine-tune how that is going to appear. Now that looks pretty good. Actually, I might not have to change it that much. So I might adjust the edge detection just a little bit to soften it up a smidge, but I'm not actually going to change much with this, I think. I will probably shift the edge. So you can shift the edge in or you can shift it out. If you pull really far over one way or the other way, you can kind of see which direction that goes. I am going to shift it out just a little bit. Not quite that much. There we go. And then I'll just go ahead and say OK. I'll grab that mask and hit delete. And so now it's done a pretty good job masking that out. Now I can go back in and do some fine tuning with this. I can try just using that magic wand tool again. Again, I'll use the same selection of mask. You know, if that doesn't work out, I can come back and edit it in more fine-tuned ways. So I'm going to go ahead and do some of that. Now when I'm masking, one of the other things I can use is the quick selection tool. So I can come in and just click around here and grab something and then hit delete. But at a certain point, even the quick selection tool doesn't necessarily do a really good job. So you can see right here, I'm losing some of that bone edge. So this is where your Wacom tablet comes in really handy. Although the quick selection tool and the quick mask tool are really helpful, at a certain point, it's just easier to go in with a brush or an eraser and just pick the hardness of it and go ahead and start masking things. So I'm just gonna go ahead and use the option control keys on my Mac. You can also use the brackets to make things bigger or smaller, but like I said, if you practice using the control option key on the Mac to change the diameter and also change the hardness, it really speeds up your workflow quite a lot. You'll notice that the size of the area I'm erasing is really small compared to the size of the brush. That's because I've changed the hardness or the firmness settings in my computer settings so that I can, you know, just press just a little bit when I want a really, really thin line and just sort of graze around the edges of things, basically setting up that boundary. And then I can come in a little bit harder to get rid of larger areas. So, and depending on what you're doing, you know, sometimes it takes a while to sort of figure out what that kind of happy medium is. Now, once I have an outline like that in my masking, if I option click on the mask itself over here in my layers, I can see that black and white area. And this makes it really easy because then I can just go in and just very quickly erase things out that are white where I want them to be white, and I don't have to worry about you know, erasing too much. So sometimes it's actually quite a bit easier to just draw around the outlines of things and then look at just the mask so that you can erase just the areas that you want. So I do have to go a little bit slower in some of these little corners, but this is probably the most effective kind of fast way of doing certain types of masking. And then I can option click back on the mask and get back to it, and I can clean up this little area right here. Now, one of the other things you'll notice is that I'm masking and I'm cleaning this up with that textured background behind it. So sometimes people like to turn off backgrounds so they can really see exactly how clean or dirty things are going to be. When I'm first masking, I don't really like to worry about that too much because sometimes depending on what's going to happen with an object, you don't really need to do really careful masking. You know, if you're going to use a lot of textures over things, then it's not going to make a big difference. Now, the flip side of that is that if I end up moving this, if I animate the position of this, let's say, then I do want to have a really close mask because any little sort of pixels floating around the edges, we're going to notice that. So, for instance, if I came up back over here, if I turned off that coat layer, I could see, let's see, where's a good little spot? Oh yeah, like right around there, we have these pixels right here. With the coat on, that doesn't make a big difference. But if I started moving around this, you can kind of see, especially when it goes over dark areas, we see that line there, and that looks really not great. So if you're going to animate the position, then yeah, you can go ahead and turn off that coat. Now the other thing you can do is you can set it to this grid view. So if you turn off all the layers, you see the alpha channel. I have my alpha channel set to really dark, but if you go to Photoshop and Preferences, and then down to Transparency and Gamut, you can change that transparency background setting. So it defaults to light, I believe. You can leave it at light, or you can set it to medium or to dark. I like to leave it to dark because it minimizes eye strain for me personally, but it really depends on your image, you know, whatever you're working with. So you can change that. You can even set up custom color ranges. So at any rate, you can do that and adjust that background how you want. Then I'll go back to that mask, grab my eraser, and I'll keep working. All right, so I have this guy mostly masked out now, but there's a couple things that I need to do to finish this up. So if I move this around, one of the things I can kind of notice is that there's some areas that have what look like a little glow on them or a little bit of an extra dark outline. So I'm going to turn off the coat again, and I'm just going to zoom in a couple times. And there's a couple different ways of addressing that. So in this case, right here, there's kind of an extra sort of dark outline right there. So one thing I can do is I can add mask to selection, sort of dark, everything that's actually a mask. And once that's selected, then what I can do is I can go to the selection settings. So if I go to select and then go down to modify, I can say expand that by say 2 pixels and it moves it outwards. So that's actually not what I want. I want to contract it. So contract by 2 pixels. So that's a little bit much. And then I could soften it. So I can go to modify and feather. I could say by 2 pixels. You don't really see anything there. Now I'm going to invert it because it's actually selecting the opposite of what I want. So if I hold down Shift Command I, so Shift Command I, it's going to invert that selection. And you don't really see anything, but now if I grab my eraser, it's going to erase on this other side of things. So what I can just do is I can kind of erase out and sort of minimize that edge. Now that's a little bit more than I wanted. So I'm going to go back to modify, and now I'm going to do contract again. And I'll say contract by 1. And now it's doing it a little bit better. I'll contract it one more time. I think it's because that feathering is set to 2. So I can use this to kind of just control how a particular edge appears. So just right around there, I'll go around and make sure there's no other really, really dark edges that look weird. Right there, maybe. Right in there. That looks okay. Now that's sort of a lighter edge, so I can do that a little bit. That's a really shadowed sort of area, so I can go like this. There we go. So it just helps control where you're masking it. So I'll hit deselect, and I'll just clean that up just a little bit more. There we go. Now the other thing you can do is you can actually burn and dodge edges. So if we go to the mask itself, you can see that this is, it's got dark areas and light areas. I can see where there's sort of pixels floating around that aren't connected to the main form. I can go in and kind of clean those up and delete them. But what I can also do is I can come in and soften it. So one thing you want to be aware of is the relative blurriness or sharpness of your photo. So while having really crisp, clear, sharp photos to begin with is a great thing, sometimes when you're compositing images together, you really want them to just match the same degree of blurriness and sharpness. So I'm just going through and kind of cleaning up the mask, making sure I don't have any weird little pixels floating around. But if I look at these teeth right here, I can see that they're quite a bit sharper than, say, that edge right there. So if I option click on this, one thing I can do is actually blur the mask itself. So if I go down to my blur tools, and my blur tool is this guy right here, it says blur tool, I can come into that mask and I'm blurring the mask. I'm not blurring the photograph. I would have to grab the other object, and that's set to a smart object right now, so that would be tough. But I can blur the mask itself. So if I pull the diameter down, I can reduce the strength of that blur. But if I go to the actual mask itself to see what it's doing, I'm just softening that edge right there. So if you have a relatively soft photograph, you don't want that edge to be harder than the photograph itself. So now that's a little bit too blurry, so I'm going to undo that. In fact, you can go back to your history and just undo a lot of that. But I am going to go and pull the strength down on that blur and just go and blur that mask just a little bit to soften that edge. So I don't want it to be blurrier than the photograph itself, but I do want it to be a bit softer. So now this might be a little bit more detailed work than you'd really need for something that's going to be photographed, but it's a useful trick in case you need it. All right, so there's that. Now, if, by the way, you don't see your blur tool, it should be bundled in with smudge and sharpen. Below here you can see I have the burn and dodge tool. We'll talk about that in a second. Down here there's these 3 dots. If I click on those 3 dots, I can go to Edit Toolbar. And if I go to Edit Toolbar, one of the things that you can do is sort of control which of these tools you see. So I really don't ever use the rectangle tool or the ellipse tools. These are things that are more for vector work, and that's something that you do in Illustrator. So I almost never use them in Photoshop. They really don't make sense. Yeah, you just almost never use them. Same thing with the pen tool. This is an incredibly useful and powerful tool in Illustrator, but in Photoshop, I just never really use it. There's not really a reason to. Same thing with selection tools. So Photoshop really is designed for working with photographs. So if you don't see the blur tool and the dodge and smudge and burn tool, you can go look on these extras and drag them back over. So for instance, if I wanted the patch tool back here, which is pretty useful sometimes, I can drag that back. I can drag in content aware. You can use the history brush. The gradient tool is handy. Paint bucket tool is handy. So that's pretty much it. The rest of them I usually leave aside. So anyway, you can control what's in your toolbar by clicking on those three dots and adjusting what you can see.